What's up, Liron here. Today we're going to learn how to plan your paintings. We're going to do that using this one. I'm going to show you how I analyze the picture and decide what I want to do with it and how I want to paint it. And then I'm going to show you the drawing process and the painting process and the removal of the tape. So I really hope you'll enjoy this one. Let's get started with planning it. So first thing is I want us to go over the reference photo and in it I will talk a bit about what I want to achieve with the painting, the different means in which I'll use to achieve that, and also some risks and dangers when working on this kind of a painting, because there are points of challenge and things you want to look at. So this is the things I think about when I'm preparing to paint. So the focal point is clearly going to be this hill and this building here up top. In all of this area, it has so many nice and rich contrasts on the rocks, especially between the darks and lights. Then we have another kind of secondary area of interest, which is the town itself, the city itself, all of the buildings here, all the way to the edge. Now, we will create a sense of depth using the different layers of the view. So we have this scene here on the left, this mountain here on the left, that's quite blue and pale if you compare it to the things that are up front, because it's really in the distance. We have this hill that's receding through the right, and then another hill possibly continuing this ridge, but it doesn't really matter. So these areas is where I may want to soften the edges, okay? On the right and on the left. I don't want them to be too striking because that'll take away from my center of attention. So this is where I'm probably going to blend edges. I'm probably going to do a bit of wet and wet and all of those good stuff. Now, as for the houses here, the hill is not really a problem. It's a matter of just abstracting the shapes of the cliffs, leaving some highlights there, and keeping an even shape of shadow. Okay, you don't want too much details and variation in the shadow. You just want there to be a couple of, like this area, all of this, the trees, the foliage, and then the hill. It's all just one big area of shadow. So you want to make sure you capture that. Now, another point of challenge, I would say, too, would be first the buildings here, because there's a lot of abstraction you'll have to do. There are barely any details. There's nothing there really. And then the foreground. The foreground is relatively empty, so we will have to spice it up using some imaginative roads and hills and stuff like that. And hopefully we'll be able to pull that off. It is important because it's quite close to us. But in terms of the actual framing, I will cut out some of the bottom part because I don't think we need that much stuff under the bottom part of these buildings. Okay, now one more thing is I'm gonna have to leave highlights here for the pure white parts of the building. We're gonna do an initial wash covering everything, but we will later on leave some, possibly also on the first wash. I'll think about it while I'm doing it. But in any case, this is it. The drawing stage is going to be rather simple, so let's get started on that. So for the drawing, and luckily this isn't too complex of a stage, especially with these kinds of views. I'm just going to put in a marking that's going to show approximately where the point of interest is going to be. Now the horizon line, or the main area, I'm going to put that around here. This is going to be the edge of that hill, or rather even lower. And then I'm going to try and connect it to this point of interest, and we'll see how that goes. I may need to move some things around. So we go like this, up the hill. That's good. That's pretty good. That's pretty accurate. Then the cliff goes down a bit. It continues, and then we have this sort of trees here, but then at the back we have this group of mountains going kind of like this and off into the distance. And it's okay that it's not exactly the same, and I wasn't able to include all of them. That's actually fine, like so. That's another mountain. Now this goes all the way together with all the buildings and the small structures and houses and whatever those are. Then we have the shapes of the cliff here, kind of like this, light and shadow. We have a structure here, and I'm gonna allow the brush to do most of the work, so I'm barely putting in anything. You know, it may be shocking to see how little details I'm putting. This is gonna be a building. These are all gonna be buildings, and they're just moving here. Now, I do want to show you this tower because that's an important part that I do want to be visible. And this, then the houses and structures meet the edge of the hill here and actually affect its shape. It becomes more stepped, more like steps. And then there are a couple of structures here as well. Now here, I'm not going to draw all of these structures. That's going to be impossible. So I'm just throwing in some lines indicating where they're gonna be, kind of approximately. There are all of these rooftops that I'm gonna put in. I'm gonna let the paint do everything here, really. We have some trees here, and then the structures. And I'm barely lifting the pencil off the paper, okay? And this allows me this level of freedom and fun, I would say, as well. I'm just enjoying doing it like that. So then we have a bunch of trees. This goes a little lower. Now we have this mountain ridge in the background. The one thing I do when I draw these, I make sure they don't intersect with anything major like this structure. Now I want to define this thing atop the hill, so it's basically, it's kind of a simple structure. It has a bit of a highlight on the right. I made it a little taller just for dramatic effect. These are all buildings and houses, believe it or not. And then we have a couple of structures here that I do want to indicate a little more accurately, with emphasis on a little, okay? Still not too many details. So we're done with everything that's human-made, probably here. A couple of chimneys, random stuff, you know, that's fine. Maybe there's a pole or something to connect, just a bit of the height and the verticals and the horizontals, that's fine. Now, here we have this big bunch of trees, like a forest area. I'm gonna indicate that, but more than that, I do have this road coming here from the left, and I do wanna make up some stuff. So we're gonna have that meet the town, and then maybe coming kind of towards us, like that. And this is totally made up. I don't know exactly even what I'm gonna put in there, but that's the way I'm gonna do it. Then there's gonna be some fences and some fields and all sorts of different elements to this huge area here. I'm just dividing it into subsections so that later on I know where I may add some details. I'm gonna add just a couple of very gentle details on the hills here of this mountain, and they have to be gentle because I don't want, conceptually, I don't want to feel like I have to paint them strongly. So this is it. Let me show it to you up close so you can see some of the details. And you don't need to know how to draw to do this, really. You just put it in, especially in these simple landscapes, which is why I love them. So now let's get to paint this. So I'm using my Paul Rubens palette. Let me flip it. And the reason I love to use it is because I have a lot of primary colors here. And it sets me free in terms of what color to use. It makes me care less about the particulars of what color I use and focus more on temperature, which is something I'm working on improving. So I'm using this kind of blue here. The sky is not a very vibrant blue. It's quite pale and neutralized, and I'm just starting to cover it up. And what's going to be really fun here is starting to, maybe a bit more blue to it, starting to establish where it's going to be warm and cool already now, because I'm going to do the underwash in a way that's going to reflect it. So this hill here is really blue, so like that. I'm not going to do too much wet in wet here. I'm going to keep it rather simple. This side of the hill is going to be pretty well shaded. I'm going to add a bit of yellow to it, just a bit. And I don't really, I know it looks a bit mad what I'm doing, a bit crazy, but there is a method to it. I am establishing some kind of a muted warm yellow here because it's not, again, it's not too bright. But here, as I get to the right side, I'm going to start using some cleaner yellow, maybe a bit of orange in it as well, like so. And these mountains are going to be pretty cool, so a bit of blue in there, but still you do want them to be a little green. Show a bit of green there. Now we're making our way closer and closer towards the houses and structures. What's important with those is most of them are white, the walls, and so they're going to be fairly blue in the shadow. So that's the kind of color I will preserve here. A bit of blue, like this. Now, the more we get that, and I will, you know what, let's put a bit of yellow into that blue, because some of them are going to be really in the light, and then some in the shadow. I'm going to put a bit of blue. I'm just trying to reflect to you what I'm thinking about and hopefully that'll help you now. It will help you get in the right mindset. Not necessarily, it's not going to give you answers to anything really. But here I'm starting to put in a bit of yellow, a bit more fun, because the happy and vibrant colors are a bit harder to produce later on. So you want to produce them as early on as you can. So even a bit of red here, I'm just throwing a bunch of colors because this area is going to be really vibrant, okay? Now I do want to green it up a bit, so let's add just a bit of blue into this mess. Like this, and then I'm gonna wrap it up with just water. You see, the moment you place the water, it makes everything flow. I want to warm it up though a bit more. I love how opaque and dominant this yellow is. You just put it there and it really overpowers everything else. But in any case, now we're pretty much done. There are a couple of white spots. That doesn't really matter as much. So here we go. I'm gonna allow this some time to dry. Let me show it to you up close before that. So you can see here, beautiful, beautiful, simple first wash. I'm gonna allow this to dry and then we'll continue. So now everything is nice and dry, and I just want to show you how beautiful these random sort of brush strokes are and how much grace and interest they add to the painting. Now, let's get started with planning this stage because it's going to be a little more complex. So I'm going to start with the mountains in the background to the right and to the left. This just seems to me like the logical place to go, as it's slightly darker than what we have here so far. So we're working dark to light to dark, as you should in watercolor painting. And I'm going to start actually with this part on the right. I don't know why, but that's what I prefer. Now, I'm using a light value, lighter than I know it should be, because I'm gonna start charging some wet on wet here and just adding details. What's important to me is to paint around this section, because that's where it's gonna be darker, but then we get to the buildings and the houses, and I wanna make sure that I leave gaps there for highlights coming on from the walls of the houses and the rooftops and everything. So we have these bunch of trees here, but then here you have to start paying attention to these things. Now I want to wet the mix a bit, because otherwise it won't be as fresh as it should be. And notice all of these wet and wets are good because they put in the details without overstating anything, and it'll give the effect that we're after here, that this is a bit in the background, it's less important, less significant. And now I'm starting to do the whole negative shape around the square shapes of the buildings, and maybe leaving a bit of a highlight here and there, kind of like that. Then connecting it to this mountain in the background. Should be lighter, actually. Let's make it a little lighter. Connecting it like that with one go. And here's where I'm gonna start blending in the edges, because I don't need a defined edge, especially in this area. So that goes like this. This entire thing, I'm gonna blur it completely. Actually, let's break off that edge as well, kind of like that, make it a little less harsh, and quickly come back and continue what we started here around the bottom, okay? Charging it with a bit more yellow just to keep things a little balanced. And this isn't necessary, this isn't necessary, going around the buildings, and we're pretty much done with this section, okay? And I can charge again with a bit of a, let's say, darker green, just a bit more, because it feels like it needs some stronger areas, but not too much. So kind of like that. Here it's already dry, so I'm not going to touch that too much. Just around here. And then I'm going to grab a bunch of really thick paint, because I want to indicate some kind of a tree texture, and I need the paint to be really thick in order for it not to disperse completely in the wet and wet process, okay? So I'm just placing in a bunch of trees because there are plenty of trees on these mountain sides, but I'm making sure that I don't go too much. And here I think we're done. We're close to overdoing it, so I don't want to overdo it. Just let's connect a couple of these. So this is done. Now we're going to move on to the left. The first thing you'll notice is that the left section is so much more blue. And so this is what I'm going to do. It's kind of a combination of blue. So it's going to be like this. And this blue is really going to push it to the background, okay? Now it's quite light still, so I don't want to go too dark here. And fill up that entire area to the left. This whole section is going to be darker, so it doesn't really matter. Just have to be a little careful around there. Now, if you notice, you do have to be careful around the structures as well. If you notice, it does have a bit of warmth in it, so I'm just going to grab a bit of red, mix it in, and just drop a bit of it kind of wet and wet here. And that's it. Don't want to overdo it, and I think that works out nicely. I will probably, I don't know if that edge bugs me or not, but let's blend a bit of that side of the mountain like this. I don't want it to be too strong there, and we're gonna leave this edge fairly well defined. And now we're done with the back section. We can start working on the actual building, and I'm gonna start top to bottom, or I might give this a bit of time to dry just to make sure I don't mess this up. Let's allow this a couple of minutes to dry so that it's at least as dry as this section. Okay, so I think it's pretty much ready to go. And I'm gonna start with this kind of grayed out cool color here. And that's gonna be the top of this tower. And I just want to make sure that I properly define, at the very least, its shape. Like so, maybe a bit, it should be darker. I'm going to charge it with some more blue. Worst case, we'll go over it again in just a few moments. But now here it becomes a bit tricky, okay? Because I want to make sure I leave enough highlights around it. So this entire right side of the cliff is kind of in the light, but there is this shadow here. Now this gets a bit green, so a bit more yellow and a bit more blue. And there is our green. Should be slightly darker. I may use a bit of that more phthalo-ish blue. This is a rather complex part of the painting, okay? So brace yourself and hope for the best. This is what I'm doing right now. Because it is rather complex, and I may not be able to narrate every single thing I'm doing, but I am keeping this highlight here, you see, and then I'm adding this indication of a cliff, a little more blue here. So this is kind of a cliff, and hopefully everything we're doing here is going to connect to a shape that's believable and it looks good. Okay, there are no guarantees, especially when I'm being this loose with my brush strokes, but I wouldn't have it any other way because that's what I enjoy the most. Now I want to apply a bit of a shadow to the left of the building. I'm using a new brush because that shadow is quite warm, like this. And then I'm going to allow these two to seep together and paint all the way up to this building. This is where I'm going to stop, okay? And then we have, you want to make sure that the shapes here at this stage aren't too fragmented and there aren't too many dots and points and because that messes things up and makes a big mess. Now here is a really critical part because I'm gonna paint around those buildings like so with some of the trees and foliage here. I'm gonna turn this a bit more green and kind of fill that area with a bit of trees and whatever that is here. And the most important part is really to paint around these buildings, okay? Leave those highlights, you need them. Then I'm gonna grab this bit of a green. I need to mute this actually, so a bit more red. When you put red into green, it mutes it. That's how it works. And then the most important part for me is that it feels like these are actually structures, okay? I'm gonna get rid of this part like this. And this is pretty much it for this section, okay? And then I can stop because I'm gonna have some highlights here. Now we're gonna go around this building here and blue it up a little more significantly, maybe even a bit of this kind of more muted indigo type of blue. And here we're gonna have a bit of a tree. This section is a bit wet still, but that's fine, I don't mind that. What we do need to make sure is that we go dark enough, because this area should be rather dark. Now I'm gonna show you a nice trick, okay? I wanna fill in this area for the building in just a moment. Let's finish with this section. It has to be really dark. I'm gonna get a bit of red here and put it in wet and wet. My point was, and here I can paint around those trees, gonna leave a bit of highlights. And then we come to the buildings like this. I don't want this building to be too fragmented from the rest of the shape. So I'm just coming back with some water. The brush is just a little wet and I'm connecting it like so. That'll make the water bleed into this area, but still keep it quite light. Okay, so now I have this house or building in essence connected to the larger wash, okay? And then here we have a couple of important highlights of the cliffside. And here we're already at the buildings. This is way too dark, messed it up. This shouldn't be as dark. And then I'm gonna add a bunch of water here. And it's gonna be a bit of a bluer blue, basically. And with that kind of bluer blue, I'm gonna start establishing some shadows on the buildings. But what's important is that while I'm doing that, I am gonna leave a couple of highlights, okay? So these are the buildings here. And you have to imagine what the shapes are gonna be like. You have to squint your eyes, look at the reference and try to figure out where can I see spots of light? Where should I leave highlights? This isn't easy. This step is not easy at all, but you get better with time. So now I do need a bit of green, dark green for these trees under the structures. Okay, there are some trees here. Now, and you see this, I'm moving outwards. This is one big process. I can't really, you can't really stop or divide it because that's just one process, okay? That's really important to understand. Next, let's go back to this bluer blue that's a little lighter, okay? And everything that has to do with the buildings, I'm gonna leave some odd highlights for the rooftops and stuff like that. Those are really important. And then I'm gonna split them and try to do that in an interesting way. But again, we have no way of knowing exactly how this will turn out. In fact, I wanna turn this a bit into red. So let's get a bunch of pure red here. And I wanna start just injecting it in some areas. And this could be rooftops, it could be a lot of things, but I feel like it needs that balance. Let me zoom in a bit. And you'll see how it kind of feels like it needs a bit of touches of maybe even orange here, just to make this blue a little more interesting. I'm starting to put in details that are allegedly final, but I don't know, I felt like putting them there. So now let's go back to some green here for those trees at the bottom. We have a tree coming through the buildings. Let's put it in. It's a bit of a risk, but sometimes I do these kinds of risky moves. And here we have a bunch of other trees that are coming up through the buildings, like so, obstructing some of them. Don't worry, later on we're gonna add a bit of a darker wash. It's gonna make things a little clearer, but all of this area is trees now. At the bottom, going around the buildings, like so. We're gonna have one big tree coming above them just to make things a little more interesting vertically and horizontally. Now we have these buildings here that I said I'm gonna draw a little more accurately here. And let's spread out with these buildings to the left. And you see how I don't leave an area until I got in all the information that I wanted, okay? Let's get a bit of orange here for the left section and start plopping that in. Again, could be rooftops, could be many things, but here we have to pick up the pace, okay? We gotta start working fast. This is a rooftop. It's a significant one too. This is a rooftop. Here we have to start picking up the pace because we have that bottom section. And I don't want this to dry. I don't want this to look too detached from the rest. But what I will say is you want to put in a bit of thought into this area. You don't want to go in blindly because it is a rather area. You want to make sure to, let's make this a little more yellow. Even a bit of orange will help. You want to make sure that you leave the areas for the highlight, for example, like we said. Leave some details that will later mean something. And it's not easy, it's not simple doing that, but you got to do your best and hope for the best. And that's all we can do. I'm gonna put in some tree kind of highlights. I'm gonna zoom in back so we can see everything. So here we go, moving on with a couple of random straight trees coming above the buildings. And this entire section is a little more heavily forested, so I'm just gonna put this color here just to make it a little darker. Went around this road. Okay, let's add some yellow here. And then while this is still kind of wet, I'm gonna go around this road that I added earlier, messed it up a bit. I'm gonna grab a bunch of more muted blue and then a bit of orange. I'm gonna start placing in some of the trees here, wet and wet. And this will make sure that they're soft, but still there. They still exist, they're still defined somewhat to some degree. This climbs above the rest. You can see here, and you have to use, when you do these kinds of wet and wet, you have to use very thick paint, otherwise it will spread out immediately and you won't have any details left, okay? So this really is an impressionistic landscape. It is very, very simplified and abstracted. Yeah, and then we're gonna leave a bit of a gap. Let's do like, I don't know, like a fence or something running along this section. Bit of lines dividing the painting, and a bit of trees across the road here, kind of like that. Oh, here comes an important part. I want this part to be a more vibrant green. So let's use this kind of yellow, and lots of it. And here, I'm gonna start placing in some fields, okay? So I'm putting this green in. It should be hopefully a happy and vibrant green. Continuing along this road that I put in earlier and kind of messed up. Like this. And then what's important is, well, this area, and I left here a highlight, I don't even know why, but it looks like a good idea. While this is still wet, you know what, let's let it dry just a bit more so that the wet and wet doesn't disperse too much. And then a lot of yellows, a bit of reds in there, because things do warm up when they get closer to us. So kind of like this. Now I can start putting in the wet and wet trees here, the rows of trees, and test. See how bad it disperses. So I can see that it's not too bad. So I can start placing those in. And you can do rows, you can do like actual dots like I'm doing here. Whatever you do, don't do it like me, make it unified. So like maybe just rows like this. Depending on how much of a simplification you want to include. Now this, I don't know why this brush stopped picking up the paint here. And okay, I'm gonna bring a bit of water here. So the thing is, when you're not using paint straight out of the tube, you will encounter sometimes some challenges. I'm gonna place in a bunch of dots here and there. And hopefully that reads as fields, okay? And then across this fence, I'm gonna put in, let's put a tree coming up through here. Then add a bit of yellow and put another one. And a bunch of shorter ones here. There has to be a shadow under that highlight. I don't know why, but even if you look at the reference, it's like a ditch or something like that. There has to be a shadow, then there has to be kind of a fence here. And later on, we can add more details, of course, dry brush or, dry on dry, something like that. I'm gonna add a lot more details, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Now, a bunch of trees here at the back, again, to make the differentiation here in the height and in the, just to make it a little more interesting a bunch of really tall trees from behind these buildings here. Connect some to here. And with that, I think this wash is pretty much done. I may add just a bunch of trees here on the border between these sections. This is like the worst demo to the worst view to make a demo on, because there just is so much going on around, but hopefully I'm able to verbalize what I'm doing in a clear way. So now what we're gonna do, sorry about the table shaking, I'm gonna let this dry and then come back with some of the darker sections, because still things need to be darker, especially here near the trees, the foliage, and also some details in windows for the houses. So let's give this a couple of minutes and come back. Okay, so now everything is dry, and I will correct some mistakes, darken some areas, do some finishing touches. The painting is like 85% done. It may not look like it, but it actually is. So regarding corrections, I actually have one major correction, and that is I left a gap here that doesn't really make sense. So I'm gonna close this part off. And now I want to start designing the shape of the trees here a little better. So a bit of green, and I just want to have them reaching out from within the cliff, kind of like that. So that's a little better. Now, a bit of greenery here, up top, above that. Kind of lost that highlight here, but I don't mind that as much. That's fine. And around this structure here, I may add a bit of details using just white pen as well, white gel pen. So I can do a couple of things here really. I want to better define this area here, this edge, like so. This entire area needs to be a little darker, I think. And then it breaks abruptly because of a cliff, kind of like that. Now here's the major part, and that is connect the shadow of the trees to that part here. Okay, so there are some very heavy dark trees, not necessarily even shadow, it's more that they're dark, and you want to make sure that they are connected. I'm gonna cut this house a little lower like this. And then connect, there are a lot of trees here. Let's do one that rises above. This area is fairly dark in the reference. I'm actually gonna darken this part as well. And you just have to think, really, take your time sometimes and think what the painting needs. Now I'm gonna connect it to some shadows in between the buildings, under rooftops, stuff like that. Already now, because I want to make, I want to cause the least amount of fragmentation I can. I'm just combining all of that. And while I do that, I could actually start adding in the details, the windows. We have this window on the tower here. Connect those to the trees, you know. This rooftop here. Just a bunch of shadows and windows and different elements of the structures. And this is pretty much where these trees end. Now here we have a bunch of other dark trees, more water. Sometimes you just run out of water and you need to get more. And then this goes like this. There's this shape of trees and shadows. I'm gonna put in a bit of orange because I feel like there is quite a significant variation in the foliage here on this side. A lot of greens and then a lot of reds and oranges and all sorts, you know, the trees can produce such a huge variety of colors, sorry. Also paint. I'm gonna add this kind of a thing here to rise above. And this is probably as abstract as you'd see me work. It's the type of work I'll produce, especially if I'm working outside and there's no real choice. So you produce these kinds of things. Usually I'm a little tighter, but I know a lot of people seek that style and they try to improve in it, and it is a challenge. So it's not that it's easy, it's just kind of my go-to in these situations. A bit of a stronger shadow to better show the triangular shape of that rooftop. And then here there's more trees and more houses, and this is the time to maybe make the shapes of these houses a little clearer. So I need a bit of a neutral mix here. I'm gonna spray some water all over my palette because I feel like the paint barely moves. That can help. So I'm gonna need a bit of red here and then a bit of blue. And start indicating the shadows underneath the houses. Now we don't want to dab too much, so I just put one straight line there to take care of all of it pretty much. Bit of details here. Which shadows under the rooftops. I could use a smaller brush, but I actually don't see the point. I mean, this looks good to me. Like so. And underneath here, under this kind of road, I'm gonna add a bit of a shadow. It could be a road, it could be a body of water. I'm not really sure. Bit of darkness to these trees. They don't have to have it, but I feel like it will look good. And with that, we're pretty much done with this section. Let's just work on this tower here at the top. We have a bit of a shadow here. We have a bit of a shadow here as well. It's barely visible. Then this detail here. A couple of windows that I make up because I want to make it a little more structure-like. Now the cliffs, I think design decision of adding a bit of red, I know funny enough, will make it look better. So I'm just gonna add a bit of red here. It's almost like pure paint really, but I think it will look good. Now I'm gonna start adding a bit of opaque orange and red to the areas around the rooftops, maybe to close off some other rooftops, or, you know, just to produce this interesting look of illusion of density. A bit of red, like so. Make this a little longer here. And here as well, this is important because here some of the red and orange paint kind of disappeared, so a bit of it here will do the painting good. A bit of here, also these rooftops are really important. I almost forgot about those. Now, what I think I'll do next is add a bunch of cast shadows, because the light generally comes from the right to the left, so I want to cast a bunch of shadows from the buildings maybe, and also from the trees and bushes and trees and then foliage, sorry, I said trees twice, and all kinds of shadows to the left, just indicating that we have some kind of a light and shadow thing going. I can add a bit of these kinds of, you know, electricity or light poles or whatever these may be. Maybe a bit of a fence also, kind of around here. This should be a fence. And then I can add a shadow to its left, kind of like that. It closes off here. There should be kind of a fence here. But I don't want to make the cast shadows too dark because they don't need to be really. Kind of like this, just a bit of an indication. And I do want to, I'm going to bring my rigger brush, and with that I'm just going to add a bit of a more serious, I would say, oh, that's way too much, that happens. Okay, so I almost got rid of it completely. A bit of kind of like this, a bit of another one here, and then connect them. There is a bit of a need for electricity even in these places. Maybe add another one here just to make sure that the foreground isn't too barren and empty, so kind of like that. And then you get this interesting elements running across the scene that can help a bit. I should have probably drawn the fences with this kind of a rigger brush, but in any case. Now let's make another kind of thing stand here. I don't even know why, I'm kind of going off of pure instinct. And strengthen this section as well. Add a bit of cast shadows. This isn't too noticeable because it's close to us, it's close to the edge. I don't want to pull the attention too much here. I know it's the foreground and it should be detailed, but I didn't want to make this part too detailed. And I think with that we're done. I don't want to overdo it, I don't want to add unnecessary details. So let me show it to you up close, and I'm very pleased with it. Obviously it's not really realistic or anything like that, maybe from afar, but overall, I'm very pleased with how it turned out. One thing I would do, and it's a bit of a risk, but let's go for it. I just thought of it now, is it does feel like these areas should be a little darker. So let's just add a bit more green here. Just to get a feeling like it gets stronger the closer it gets to us. It may be a mistake. I don't mind that. I'm willing to take risks usually, if it means I'm learning and improving. It feels a little better. I think especially the left section needs it actually. So let's do that. Kind of like this. I don't care that it goes over the wet and wet or previous details. That's fine. I did feel like it makes things a little more balanced, okay? And this is it. Final result. Greens. All sorts of houses and structures. I could actually, one last thing for real. That is to add to the top of this tower, whatever that is, just a bit of, you know what? Let's leave it as a highlight. I like it that way. So in any case, I hope you enjoyed this process, and now we can wrap it up. Now, one moment, sorry about that. I always promised that I'll remove the tape, and I decided to keep my promise today. So here we go. Let me know your thoughts in a comment down below, what this looks like without the tape. And also, if you try this out, be sure to let me know how it turned out. I'm really curious. And I didn't allow it too much time to dry and to unbuckle, so it will be a bit buckled, but nothing too bad. And here we go, final result. And you can see how lame I am at cutting the paper straight. But in any case, here it is, and now we can truly wrap it up. So this is it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed seeing the full process from start to finish. This is a reference photo I'm already quite familiar with because, as I mentioned, it's the second time I paint it, and because of that, I actually know what I'm doing. For the first time, when you encounter a reference photo and it's going to be completely different than this one, you'll be unfamiliar with it and you'll have no idea what you're doing, and that's fine. This is why we do repetitions. This is why we paint the same scene twice. It can really help, or even more than twice. I try and do that often as well. But in any case, don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe if you still haven't. I have tons of other videos. If this is the first one you come across, definitely want to check the other ones, and I will see you again in another one real soon.